So, the question we are asking today is simple, yet baffling. How come an 80-year-old tank is still in service today? No tank in history has been produced in the quantities that this one has. This is the T-55, with some sources saying as many as 100,000 units have been built since 1946. It is truly the AK-47 of the tank world. It boasts a 100mm main gun, 200mm of frontal armor, and a rugged V12 diesel engine that sounds like the apocalypse when it starts up. But by any current metrics, the T-55 leaves a lot to be desired. It is incredibly cramped, it is crude, and it lacks the digital sophistication of modern armor. And yet, it is fighting on front lines around the world right now, from the deserts of the Middle East to the fields of Ukraine. And perhaps just as importantly for us today, why is this specific one I'm standing on full of holes? We are going to answer all of that. But first, if you want to keep exploring the history of armored warfare with us, please subscribe to the Tank Museum channel and hit that notification bell. It really is the best way to support the work we do here in preserving these machines. Now, let's get inside the beast. To understand the T-55, we have to look at its ancestor, the legendary T-34-85. Now, at first glance, it may seem that going from the T-34 to the T-55 is a massive leap in design, a quantum jump from World War II technology to Cold War modernity. But in fact, it really isn't. There is a clear evolutionary process. We represent a straight line of engineering thinking. We're just missing a link. As early as 1942, the Soviet High Command wanted a replacement tank, not just an upgrade. They knew the T-34's sloped armor was becoming less effective against high-velocity German guns. This desire for a new platform materialized in the form of the T-44. This was an 85mm equipped medium tank capable of taking a hit from the feared German 88mm guns found on the Tiger. The T-44 was revolutionary for two specific characteristics that were firsts for Soviet tank design but remain vital features on Russian tanks being produced even in the 21st century. First, they finally ditched the Christie suspension. The T-34 used the Christie system, which involved large springs housed inside the hull walls. It was great for speed, but it took up a huge amount of internal volume, space that could be used for fuel or ammunition. The T-44 replaced this with a torsion bar suspension, which sits flat on the floor of the hull, freeing up massive amounts of room. Second, they introduced the transverse engine mount. In the T-34, the big V12 engine sat lengthwise, front to back. In the T-44, they rotated it 90 degrees. This shortened the engine compartment significantly, allowing the turret to be moved further back towards the center of the hull. It solved the T-34's notorious nose-heavy balance issues. This tank, the T-44, is our missing link. It had a brand new hull mounting the best gun of the day, the 85mm ZIS S-53. However, by the end of the war, the Soviets were unconvinced that the 85mm was sufficient to deal with emerging threats like the German Tiger II and the upcoming American Pershing. They needed a bigger stick. The replacement for the iconic 85mm was to be a 100mm cannon. This gun, the D-10S, was already equipping the Su-100 self-propelled gun. It was a potent weapon, capable of knocking out anything on the battlefield. But the Su-100 had a serious limitation. It had no turret. The gun was fixed in the hull. The Soviets tried to mount the upgraded weapon, the D-10T, onto the T-44 turret, but the chassis just couldn't handle the recoil and balance issues. It was effectively tearing the turret ring apart. It was fraught with technical demons. So, did they go back to the drawing board? Well, no. Remarkably, all of this development was happening before the end of the Second World War. A prototype of a new tank, derived from the T-44 but successfully mounting the 100mm gun, rolled out of the Nizhny Tagil plant on January 30, 1945. This tank was called the T-54. Though it was still a prototype, it became known as the T-54 Model 1945. But here's the catch. The Model 1945 looked nothing like the T-54 or T-55 we see today. In fact, the only similarity is the hull and the gun caliber. The turret had shot traps everywhere, focusing enemy fire right down into the crew compartment. By 1946, it was clear that a lot of work was required to get this vehicle into service. They nearly got it right with the subsequent Model 1947, except testing showed the turret shape was still deflecting shells into the hull roof. Further development through the Model 1949 and Model 1951 finally solved those aerodynamic and ballistic problems. And finally, the Soviets ended up with the iconic dome or mushroom turret shape that we all know and love. It was ballistically superb, offering excellent protection for its weight class. Except this is still not a T-55, it is still a T-54. So what is the difference between the two? At first glance, they seem essentially the same tank. Even NATO intelligence often combined them under a 1 T-54-55 bracket, because externally they are almost identical. But the T-55 is a substantially better fighting vehicle than its predecessor. So how do we get from the T-54 to the T-55? Essentially, the T-55 is a greatest hits album of Soviet tank design up to that point. It used the T-54 as a base vehicle, but upgraded almost every internal system to meet the terrifying requirements of atomic warfare. Let's look at firepower first. While the gun remains a 100mm, it is a higher power version dubbed the D10T2S. Crucially, it came with a two-plane stabilizer. In the T-34 or early T-54s, if you wanted to fire accurately, the tank had to stop. The moment you moved, the gun bounced violently. The T-55 stabilizer kept the gun level on the target even while driving over rough terrain, allowing the tank to fire on the move, something Western tanks struggled to match at the time.
Then there is mobility. The V12 diesel engine was upgraded from 520 horsepower to 580 horsepower. This gave the tank an improved power-to-weight ratio. They also added a starter compressor to ensure the engine would turn over in the brutal Russian winter. They added infrared night driving sights and searchlights. A fire suppression system was adopted to save the crew if the fuel or ammo was hit. They also installed a thermal smoke generating system. Instead of using smoke grenades, this system injects diesel fuel directly onto the hot exhaust manifold. It vaporizes instantly, creating a massive, thick white smoke screen that can cover an entire retreat. If you've ever been to Tankfest and seen a Soviet tank disappear in a cloud of white, that's exactly what is happening. Crucially, the T-55 could now mount external fuel drums on the rear deck. This extended its operational range significantly, fitting the Soviet doctrine of deep battle, pushing tanks hundreds of kilometers into enemy territory without stopping for logistics. But the most defining feature of the T-55, the reason it exists as a separate designation from the T-54, was the PAZ system. This stands for Protiv Atomanya Zashita, protection against atomic defense. In the 1950s, the Soviet Union fully expected the next war to be nuclear. They needed a tank that could drive through a nuclear mushroom cloud and keep fighting. The PAZ system seals the tank hermetically and overpressurizes the fighting compartment with filtered air. This positive pressure ensures that if there are any small leaks, air blows out, keeping radioactive dust out. They also added a protective lead-impregnated lining inside the armor to absorb radiation and reduce spalling, which is when the metal on the inside of the tank flakes off and turns into shrapnel after a hit. And so, with these modifications, the T-55 was born. But this was only the beginning of its life. In 1981, when T-55 manufacturing eventually ceased, the Soviets had 4 different main battle tanks in simultaneous production. And yes, by the 70s, they were classifying the T-55 as a main battle tank, something it was never originally intended to be. It was designed as a medium tank, meant to swarm alongside the heavy IS-series tanks. By the late 70s and early 80s, it was becoming clear that older tanks like the T-55 would be totally outclassed by the latest generation of NATO armor, such as the British Chieftain, the German Leopard 2, or the American M60, and eventually the Abrams.
Its combat capability was waning severely. For example, its 100mm gun had an effective range of just over 1.5 kilometers. By comparison, British Chieftain crews were trained to start engaging targets at 3 to 4 kilometers. In a European plain scenario, the T-55s would be slaughtered before they could even return fire. The disparity in optics and gunnery was becoming fatal. To combat this, a massive upgrade program was initiated. They introduced a new fire control system called Volna, consisting of a gunner's sight, a laser rangefinder, and a ballistic computer. This finally gave the T-55 a chance to hit targets at longer ranges without relying on simple stadiometric rangefinding. They also introduced the Bastion missile system. This was a laser-guided anti-tank missile fired through the gun barrel. It could hit targets out to 4 kilometers. In theory, this allowed the T-55 to outrange NATO armor, but in practice, the crew had to maintain a line of sight for the missile's entire flight time. An experienced NATO crew on the receiving end would likely spot the launch plume and return fire with a high-velocity sabot round, destroying the T-55 before the slow missile ever arrived. They also up-armored the tank. You might have seen T-55s with what looked like extra blocks on the turret front. These were passive armor arrays consisting of stacked, spaced steel plates. They were affectionately nicknamed Ilyich's eyebrows, after the bushy eyebrows of Soviet Premier Leonid Ilyich Brezhnev. Later, these were replaced by explosive reactive armor, or ERA. These are bricks of explosives designed to detonate on impact and disrupt incoming shape-charge warheads. A typical upgrade package included roughly 40 blocks on the turret, 44 on the upper glacis, and a whopping 84 on the side skirts. This gave the old tank a fighting chance against infantry anti-tank weapons like the RPG-7 or the Law. So, the T-55 is outdated, cramped, and technologically inferior to almost everything NATO has. Why is it still around? Why hasn't it been scrapped like the Centurion? The Centurion was an exceptional vehicle, widely considered one of the best tanks ever made. But apart from the heavily modified South African Oliphant, the Centurion isn't in frontline service anywhere. It's a museum piece. The difference lies in the Soviet philosophy of never throw anything away. Storing military equipment is tricky, particularly in a damp northern European climate where rust is the enemy. Vehicles need to be stored indoors, climate-controlled, and maintained. The Soviets, however, had no such problem. They weren't short of space, and the vast Siberian tundra offers low humidity and freezing temperatures. It acts as a natural freezer. It was actually cheaper to park vast fleets of T-55s in the open air of Siberia than to pay to scrap them. Another reason was simply that the Soviet army needed them. They were in production until 1981 and in frontline service until the fall of the Iron Curtain in 1989. They needed quantity. The Soviet doctrine relied on mass attacks, overwhelming the enemy with sheer numbers. How many were actually produced? That is the million-dollar question. The common number thrown around is 100,000 units. This likely includes the T-54, T-55, T-62, and the Chinese license-built variant, the Type 59. Even if we strip away the T-62s, the number is staggering, probably in excess of any other tank design in history. According to the Conventional Forces Treaty in Europe in 1990, the USSR still had nearly 7,600 T-55s and 3,500 T-54s just west of the Ural Mountains alone. That is a massive armored fist, even if half of them didn't start.
The T-55 was the AK-47 of tanks because it was exported to everyone. The Soviets sold it to Warsaw Pact nations, to China, to the Middle East, and to Africa. These nations were often unable to maintain complex modern tanks. If you sell a developing nation a complex gas turbine tank, it will break down in a week. The T-55, however, is essentially a tractor with a gun. It's simple, rugged, and easy to fix with a hammer. This generous marketing ensured the T-55 went global. But numbers aren't everything. How good was it when the shooting started? Honestly, it's a mixed bag. When the T-55 went up against Western-built tanks, it tended to struggle. One of the first major tests was the 1973 Yom Kippur War. Egypt, Syria, and Iraq deployed the T-55 in huge numbers. In the Golan Heights, things did not go well. Of the over 1,500 tanks lost by the Arab armies, hundreds were T-55s knocked out by Israeli Centurions. The Centurions had better crews, better depression angles on their guns, allowing them to hide behind ridges, and they simply outshot their opponents from defensive positions. The Valley of Tears became a graveyard for the T-55. The Soviet design had a fatal flaw. The gun could not depress enough. On hilly terrain, the T-55 had to expose its entire hull to fire at an enemy below, whereas the Centurion could just peek its turret over the ridge. However, the T-55 proved resilient in other conflicts, like the Iran-Iraq War, where it often fought against other T-55s or similarly aged equipment. Iraq actually learned some hard lessons about the tank's vulnerability to modern anti-tank weapons. To combat this, they created a specific variant we have here at the museum, the T-55 Enigma. It looks rudimentary, with these boxy armor additions on the turret and hull. These look homemade, but they were actually a standardized modification designed for local production. Inside these boxes are spaced layers of steel and rubber composite. And you know what? It worked. This armor could stop almost every anti-tank missile in the NATO inventory at the time, except for the heavy Hellfire missile. But then came the Gulf War in 1991. This conflict exposed the T-55's obsolescence in the face of modern Western doctrine. The coalition forces had thermal optics that could see through the night and dust. The Iraqis were effectively blind. The T-55 became the victim of the longest recorded tank-on-tank kill in history during this war. A British Challenger 1 engaged an Iraqi T-55 at 4,700 meters, nearly 3 miles away. The round took several seconds to reach the target. The Iraqi crew likely never even saw the Challenger that killed them. It was a massacre, proving that in modern warfare, if you can be seen, you can be killed. All of this would suggest that by the 2020s, fielding a T-55 would be suicide. And yet, in Ukraine, it is being used extensively by both sides in the largest war in Europe since 1945. By October 2022, Ukraine received M55S tanks from Slovenia. These are T-55s, but heavily upgraded with reactive armor and a NATO standard 105mm gun. Ironically, they now carry the same gun as their old rival, the Centurion.
These tanks are being used effectively for fire support and infantry screening. Russia, on the other hand, has been dragging base model T-55s out of deep storage to replace their staggering losses. But, and this is important, they aren't generally using them as tanks to fight other tanks. They are largely being used as mobile protected artillery. A T-55 provides more armor than an infantry fighting vehicle and carries a big 100mm high explosive shell. They sit back firing indirectly at Ukrainian positions using drone correction. They are used for fire support, intended to suppress infantry and destroy fortifications. In this role, provided they stay out of range of javelins and modern MBTs, they are still a deadly and cost-effective weapon. It's a testament to the versatility of the chassis. You can bolt a mine-clearing roller to the front, you can turn it into a recovery vehicle, or you can bury it in the ground as a pillbox. The T-55 does it all. So let's go back to our cutaway tank here in the arena. The holes in this specific vehicle were cut for training, to let instructors see inside while crews learn the ropes. You can see the loader station here. It's worth noting the T-55 is terrible for the loader. The gun breaches to the right, meaning the loader has to use his left hand to shove a heavy shell into the breech. It's ergonomically a nightmare. It's hot, loud, and full of sharp edges. But the holes in the T-55's reputation, its cramped interior, its poor range, its volatile ammo storage, were patched over by sheer volume, adaptability, and simplicity. The T-55 has endured partly due to its sheer numbers, but also because sometimes you don't need the best tank. You just need a tank that works, runs on bad fuel, requires minimal training to drive, and is available right now. In a war of attrition, quantity has a quality all its own. Isn't it remarkable that a vehicle conceived at the end of the Second World War, designed to fight the Nazis, is still a serious consideration for armies 80 years later? It has outlived the empire that built it, and it will likely outlive many of the modern tanks trying to destroy it today. If you've enjoyed this deep dive into the T-55, please leave a like. It really helps us beat the algorithm and get this history to a wider audience. Don't forget to subscribe, and if you can,